Hey guys, tonight we're drifting out past the edge of the known world with a fleet that left Spain in 1519 expecting a shortcut to a handful of islands, and returned 3 years later having done something no one had ever managed before, although the man who planned the whole voyage wasn't there to see it. 5 ships, something like 270 men, 1 king's fortune in borrowed credit, and a captain general who would be dead before the voyage was even half finished. Tonight we're following what happened after he died, the parts of the story Ferdinand Magellan himself never lived to tell, and that only made it home because one seasick Venetian nobleman refused to stop writing things down. Welcome aboard a fleet that most of Europe expected to sink, capsize, or simply vanish somewhere past the Canary Islands. Go ahead and dim the lights now. Maybe let a fan hum low in the corner. Salt air white noise. Something like wind finding its way into rigging that hasn't been checked in weeks. You're warm right now. Blankets pulled up. Nothing more urgent tonight than sleep. That won't be true for the men in this story. For them, warm was already a memory by the time the real trouble started. So settle in, and let's ease into tonight's voyage together. The fleet that sailed under a foreign flag on the last night of March 1520. 4 ships sat at anchor in a harbour so bleak the Spanish had simply named it Puerto San Julian, St. Julian's Port, because there wasn't much else to call it. Rock, wind, a colony of strange, flightless birds nobody in Europe had a word for yet, which the crews started calling penguins. A name that would eventually outlive the empire that sent them there. And aboard 3 of those 4 ships, a plan had been quietly assembling itself for weeks. Relieve their Portuguese captain general of command before he sailed the fleet somewhere none of them would come back from. By dawn on Palm Sunday, the plan had mostly worked. 3 of the 5 ship captains, Juan de Cartagena, Gaspar de Quesada, and Luis de Mendoza, had effectively seized control of 3 vessels. By the following week, the mutiny had entirely unraveled, and one of the men who planned it was dead in the water with a knife wound in his throat, while another sat in the hold of the flagship awaiting a sentence that would end with his own servant being handed a sword and ordered to do the cutting. This is the story of the fleet that made him do it. The Armada de Molucca. 5 aging ships that a foreign captain talked a teenage king into funding, and the voyage that would eventually circle the entire planet without the man who started it ever seeing more than a third of the route. Ferdinand Magellan was born around 1480 in the hill country of northern Portugal, and by the time he was in his 30s he had already spent close to a decade fighting for the Portuguese crown across the Indian Ocean world, present at the capture of Malacca in 1511, wounded badly enough at Azamor in Morocco in 1513 that he limped for the rest of his life. None of it earned him what he wanted. He asked King Manuel I of Portugal for a modest raise to his pension. Manuel refused. He asked for command of an expedition. Manuel refused that too, and, according to several accounts from the period, though the exact wording can't be verified, reportedly told Magellan his services simply weren't needed anymore, in whatever language a king uses to end a career. So Magellan did something that, for a Portuguese nobleman in 1517, was close to unthinkable. He walked south across the border into Spain and offered his services and his charts to Portugal's rival. What he offered was a theory dressed up as a business proposition. The Spice Islands, the Moluccas, a tiny cluster of volcanic islands in what's now eastern Indonesia, the only place on Earth where cloves grew, had already been claimed by Portugal, which controlled the eastern route around Africa and through the Indian Ocean. But the Treaty of Tordesillas, signed back in 1494, had split the entire non-European world down an imaginary line, granting Spain everything to the west of it. If a ship could reach the Spice Islands by sailing west instead of east, Magellan argued. Spain could claim the same fortune in cloves and nutmeg without technically breaking a single treaty. There was, he assured the young King Charles I, barely 18 years old, and soon to be crowned Holy Roman Emperor as Charles V, a strait somewhere near the bottom of South America that would let a fleet pass clean through into a second ocean on the far side. He had never seen this strait. Nobody had. Part of his confidence came from a friend, Francisco Serra, who had settled years earlier among the Spice Islands themselves and written Magellan letters describing their wealth firsthand. Letters that, along with the Portuguese pilot's private charts Magellan probably shouldn't have had access to, formed the entire evidentiary basis of a proposal that would eventually cost several hundred men their lives. Charles signed off on it anyway. On the 22nd of March, 1518, in the city of Valladolid, over the loud and increasingly frantic objections of the Portuguese ambassador to Spain, Sebastián Levares, who spent the following year writing home to King Manuel, begging him to sabotage the expedition by any means available. Bribery, delay, even assassination were all floated as options in the surviving correspondence, though none of it ultimately worked. 5 ships were purchased and refitted for the voyage: the Trinidad, roughly 110 tons and Magellan's own flagship; the San Antonio, the largest of the fleet at around 120 tons; the Concepcion and the Victoria, mid-sized at 90 and 85 tons; and the tiny Santiago, barely 75 tons, meant to scout ahead in shallow water. Here's the thing about all 5 of them. They were old. Merchant ships, patched and recorked for a voyage that would ask more of their hulls than any of them had ever been built for. Loaded with provisions the Casa de Contratacin's surviving inventories describe in staggering bulk: hundreds of thousands of pounds of ship's biscuit, thousands of gallons of wine, barrels of salted sardines and dried meat, and cheese by the ton, all meant to feed a crew of roughly 270 men from at least half a dozen nations: Spaniards, Portuguese, Italians, Greeks, a scattering of Frenchmen and Germans, one recorded Englishman, and Magellan's own Malay slave and interpreter, a man recorded only as Enrique, who would end up mattering to this story more than almost anyone realized at the time. Departure day itself, the 20th of September, 1519, carried the kind of ceremony a voyage this expensive and this politically fraught was always going to demand. Priests blessing each of the 5 ships in turn, cannon salutes echoing across the harbour at Sanlúcar de Barrameda. Crowds gathered along the shoreline to watch a fleet sail out that most of them fully expected never to see again in any recognizable form. Nobody watching from the docks that morning, family members included, had any real frame of reference for what 3 years or the other side of the world actually meant in practical terms. Wives and mothers said goodbye the same way they would have for a voyage to the Canaries or the Caribbean, because there simply wasn't yet a category of human experience for what this particular fleet was actually about to attempt. The crew itself, muster rolls suggest, was a genuinely remarkable cross-section of early 16th century Europe, crammed onto 5 small wooden hulls. Roughly 200 Spaniards forming the core of the fleet, joined by dozens of Portuguese sailors who'd followed Magellan across the border out of loyalty or simple opportunity. A scattering of Italians, drawn partly by Pigafetta's own presence and partly by the general Italian appetite for exactly this kind of speculative venture. Greek and French and German sailors signed on wherever the Casa de Contratacin could find experienced hands, and at least one Englishman whose name survives in the records without much else attached to it. Layered under all of that was the ordinary hierarchy of any ship's company: officers, pilots, master gunners, carpenters, caulkers, a barber surgeon responsible for everything from bloodletting to amputation, and at the very bottom of the pay scale, ship's boys as young as 12 or 13, who'd signed on as pages and servants, too young to fully understand what they were agreeing to and too poor in most cases to have any better option waiting for them at home. And almost from the moment the fleet cleared Sanlúcar de Barrameda that morning, a good portion of that crew hated their captain general. Not personality hated him, structurally hated him. Magellan was Portuguese, commanding a Spanish fleet, funded by a Spanish crown. At a moment when Spain and Portugal treated each other the way two brothers treat a shared inheritance. Juan de Cartagena, captain of the San Antonio, held a secondary royal appointment as a kind of co-commander explicitly meant to check Magellan's authority, a built-in rival stitched into the chain of command before the ships had even left harbour. The friction surfaced early. By the time the fleet reached the Canary Islands less than a week into the voyage, Cartagena was already questioning Magellan's course, and Magellan's own father-in-law back in Spain, Diogo Barbosa, had sent a secret warning ahead by fast courier claiming several of the Spanish officers were quietly planning to murder or maroon their Portuguese commander before the fleet even reached open ocean. Magellan changed course slightly, doubled his watch, and said nothing about it publicly. He simply filed it away. By late November, some 2 months and roughly 4,000 miles into the crossing, that filed-away grievance boiled over for the first time. Cartagena openly challenged Magellan's authority during a fleet conference, refusing to address him by his proper title and questioning a course decision in front of the other captains. Magellan had him arrested on the spot, stripped of his command, and placed under guard aboard the Concepcion. A public humiliation for a man who'd arrived expecting to share power, and precisely the kind of grievance that doesn't simply dissolve because a captain general has the guns to enforce it. The fleet pressed on, regardless, reaching Rio de Janeiro on the 13th of December, 1519, where the crew traded knives and mirrors for fresh food and briefly enjoyed something close to comfort before pushing further south along a coastline no European chart adequately covered. Past a wide river mouth, the crew initially, hopefully, mistook for the strait itself. The same Rio de la Plata where a Spanish explorer named Juan das de Sols had been killed and reportedly eaten by local warriors just 3 years earlier, a detail the more superstitious sailors aboard were not exactly thrilled to be reminded of. None of that made the winter of 1520 any easier. The fleet reached Puerto San Julián on the 31st of March, and Magellan made the call to winter there, nearly 5 months. Rationed food, brutal cold. No clear proof yet that the strait he'd promised even existed. Here's what a captain does not want. 5 months into a voyage that's already run short on both patience and biscuit. Idle men with time to talk. And talk they did. By Palm Sunday, the 1st of April, Cartagena, freed from cabin arrest by sympathetic officers who'd quietly restored his authority behind Magellan's back, had linked up with Quesada of the Concepcion and Mendoza of the Victoria, and together they moved to seize 3 of the 4 ships anchored in the bay, intending to either turn the fleet around outright or simply strand Magellan on the shore and sail home without him. What happened next is the reason San Julián shows up in almost every account of the voyage, disputed details and all. The sources here lean heavily on the later, official Spanish record, and on Antonio Pigafetta's journal, both written by men loyal to Magellan's side. So some of the finer color should be read with that in mind. What's well documented is the outcome. Magellan, still in command of the Trinidad and the small Santiago, sent a boarding party under a trusted officer, Gonzalo Gómez de Espinosa, to retake the Victoria under the guise of delivering a routine message. And when Mendoza laughed off the summons, Espinosa stabbed him through the throat on his own deck. The Victoria fell back into loyalist hands within minutes. By the following morning, with the Trinidad and Victoria now blocking the harbour mouth, Cartagena and Quesada's remaining ships had no way out, and no real option left but surrender. The reckoning that followed was calculated, not chaotic. Magellan needed to make an example without gutting his own officer corps 2/3 of the way to nowhere. Quesada was tried and beheaded, And, in a detail that tends to stop people cold every time it's retold, the executioner's job was handed to Quesada's own servant, Luis de Molino, who was offered a pardon in exchange for wielding the sword against the man he'd served. He did it. His life, weighed against his captain's, wasn't really a choice at all. Cartagena wasn't executed outright. His rank made that politically messy, but months later, when the fleet finally departed San Julián that August, Magellan marooned him on the empty coastline along with a mutinous priest, Father Pedro Sninchez de la Reina, and simply sailed on. Neither man was ever seen again. No search party. No burial. Just two names that stop appearing in the ship's muster after a certain date, which is its own kind of historical record. An absence where a person used to be. And here's the detail that makes this chapter matter for everything still to come. Magellan didn't execute everyone who'd taken part in the mutiny. Dozens of lower-ranking sailors who'd simply followed their captain's orders were pardoned outright, sentenced instead to hard labor, pumping bilge water, working the anchor windlass, the unglamorous jobs nobody fought over. One of those pardoned men was a Basque sailor named Juan Sebastián Elcano, a ship's master who'd sided with the mutineers and would, by any reasonable expectation, have been marked as a man Magellan could never trust again. Keep that name. In 18 months, when Magellan is no longer alive to have an opinion about anything, it's Elcano who ends up in command of the only ship that makes it all the way home. The financing behind all of this deserves its own moment, because it explains exactly how much was riding on 5 old merchant hulls making it back with something to show for themselves. The Crown's contribution ran to something in the neighborhood of 8 million maravedis, a genuinely enormous sum for the period, roughly equivalent to what an entire small province might generate in tax revenue over several years, supplemented by private investors and by a consortium of German and Genoese bankers who'd backed plenty of ventures before, but had never bankrolled anything quite this speculative. An ordinary seaman signed on for wages around 1,000 maravedis a month, decent money by the standard of the day, with the promise of a share in whatever the voyage actually brought home. Nobody signing those articles in the summer of 1519 had any real way to know whether that share would end up being a fortune in cloves, or, for the vast majority of them, nothing at all. Paid out posthumously to a widow back in a Spanish port town who wouldn't learn her husband was dead for another 3 years. The provisioning itself is worth a moment too, if only because the sheer scale of it says something the mutiny and the executions don't. Surviving inventories from the Casa de Contratasin, the royal trading house in Seville that oversaw the whole outfitting, list well over 200,000 pounds of ship's biscuit loaded across the 5 holds, alongside barrels of salted sardines, dried beef, and enough olive oil, vinegar and wine to theoretically last the crew through a voyage nobody involved could actually predict the length of. Livestock came aboard too, pigs and chickens penned on deck, meant to provide fresh meat for as long as the animals themselves survived the crossing, though most of them didn't outlast the first few months at sea. Here's the thing about provisioning a voyage like this one. Every single calculation assumed a trip of a certain rough length, based on Magellan's own optimistic reading of half-legendary charts. Every one of those calculations was about to be proven wrong by a margin nobody in Seville could have planned around, and the men eating weevil biscuit 2 years later, in the middle of an ocean nobody in Spain had ever heard the size of, would be the ones paying for that miscalculation. There's a bitter kind of irony sitting inside the San Julián mutiny that's worth pausing on, rather than rushing past. Every single man involved, the ones executed, the ones marooned, the ones pardoned and put back to work hauling rope, believed in that freezing harbor at the literal bottom of the map, that turning back was the sane choice and pressing forward was the fantasy. They weren't wrong to be afraid. They were, as it turned out, wrong about which direction the real danger was waiting in. The pardoned men, somewhere around 40 of them, by the surviving muster records, spared the noose but not the humiliation, spent the following weeks doing the ship's hardest, least glamorous labor as a condition of their mercy, hauling the anchor windlass by hand in freezing water, pumping bilges that never seemed to stay dry, scraping barnacles off the hulls in the shallows, where the cold cut through wet wool in minutes. It wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was Magellan making a second, quieter point to sit alongside the first. That he was willing to forgive, but forgiveness on this fleet came with interest attached, paid in blistered hands and aching backs, and every man doing that labor knew exactly why he'd been spared, and exactly what would happen if he forgot it twice. Welcome to the bottom of the world, in other words, 5 months of it, with a Captain General who'd just proven exactly what he was willing to do to anyone who doubted him out loud. And a strait still to be found. What that 5-month wait actually looked like day to day, the hunting, the boredom, and one encounter with the local Patagonian people that would give this entire stretch of coastline its name, is where this story goes next. That long, cold wait at anchor wasn't just politics simmering toward a mutiny. It was also the strangest stretch of ordinary daily life the entire voyage would produce, and it left behind one of the most vivid, most disputed, and most quietly heartbreaking episodes in Pigafetta's entire journal. Let's step back a little further, before the swords came out, and spend some time at anchor. A season at the bottom of the world. Rewind 3 months first, because the road to that frozen anchorage was its own kind of lesson in false hope. Leaving Rio de Janeiro in the second week of December 1519, well fed for once and briefly optimistic, the fleet pressed south along a coast that kept teasing the one thing everyone aboard wanted most, a gap wide enough to be the strait. The widest, most promising of those false leads was a river mouth so enormous that from a distance it looked less like a river and more like an entire sea swallowing the land whole, the Rio de la Plata, which the crew explored hopefully for the better part of 2 weeks, before the water turned unmistakably fresh and muddy instead of salt, the telltale sign of a river system rather than an oceanic passage. It was a bitter disappointment dressed up as due diligence, made worse by the fact that this particular stretch of coastline already carried a grim reputation among Spanish sailors. A previous explorer, Juan Daz de Sols, had anchored in these same waters back in 1516, gone ashore with a small party, and never came back, reportedly killed and eaten by the Chara people who lived along the coast. Whether that account is fully accurate, or partly the kind of lurid rumor that grows in the retelling, is hard to say for certain. But every sailor aboard Magellan's fleet had heard some version of it, and more than one man crossed himself a little more fervently than usual each time a longboat was lowered to explore yet another unpromising inlet along this same stretch of shoreline. By the time the fleet finally reached Puerto San Julián on the 31st of March 1520, they'd spent nearly 4 months creeping down roughly 1,600 miles of increasingly hostile, increasingly unfamiliar coastline, chasing one false strait after another, watching the days grow shorter and the air grow colder as the southern hemisphere's autumn tightened its grip. It's worth remembering, every time this story reaches for a dramatic set piece, a mutiny, a battle, a starving ocean crossing, that most of the actual voyage looked like this instead. Slow, grinding, uneventful searching, mile after mile of coastline that refused to be the thing everyone was looking for. That's the texture the winter at anchor grew out of, and it's worth holding on to as we step ashore. The first thing you notice, climbing up onto the Trinidad's deck on an April morning at Puerto San Julián, is the wind, a flat, relentless, freezing wind off open ocean, with nothing between here and Antarctica to slow it down. carrying the mineral smell of wet stone and cold salt water, instead of anything resembling a green, growing thing. You've been at anchor here for 3 weeks already, part of roughly 230 men left after the mutiny's dust has settled, and the novelty of solid ground, even ground this bleak, wore off somewhere around day 4. What's left now is routine, ration counts, watch rotations, and an enormous amount of waiting for a winter that shows no particular interest in ending on schedule. By the time the fleet reached San Julian, most of the livestock loaded back in Seville the previous September was already gone. The pigs and chickens penned on deck had died off steadily, over 6 months at sea. Some from the cold as the fleet pushed further south than any of them had been bred to tolerate. Others simply consumed early once fresh meat became the only meat anyone particularly wanted to eat. What that meant, practically, was that the hunting parties going ashore at San Julian weren't a pleasant supplement to a well-stocked larder. They were, increasingly, the only reliable source of anything resembling fresh food the fleet had left, which made every failed hunt a genuinely bad day rather than a minor inconvenience. Food at anchor means something different than food at sea. With the fleet not moving, hunting parties go ashore regularly. And here you're introduced to a strange, long-legged, camel-faced animal the crew has started calling by the local Guaran word they picked up further north, guanaco, whose meat, roasted over driftwood fires, tastes gamey, but is at least fresh. A genuine luxury after months of salted meat gone grey at the edges. Seals and the flightless penguins round out the diet, along with shellfish gathered at low tide by men whose hands have gone permanently raw from the cold water. None of it is abundant. All of it beats another week of weevil biscuit. Idle hands on a fleet like this one don't actually stay idle, whatever the sailors themselves might have preferred. With the ships anchored for months rather than weeks, the carpenters and caulkers finally got the chance to do the kind of thorough hull maintenance that's impossible underway, careening each vessel in turn, hauling her over onto her side in the shallows at low tide to scrape away the barnacles and shipworm that had been quietly chewing through the timbers since Spain. It's unglamorous, exhausting work, standing knee-deep in freezing water with a scraper, and it also happens to be the single best explanation for why these particular 4 ships, battered as they already were, held together long enough to find a strait at all. Whatever else can be said about the men doing that work, mutineers and loyalists alike, since ship's maintenance didn't much care which side of the recent argument you'd been on, they were, in a very literal sense, keeping everyone else afloat. Superstition filled in whatever the maintenance schedule didn't. This far south, past every line on every chart any of these sailors had ever trained on, old stories about the edges of the world resurfaced with real force, sea monsters, boiling water at the world's rim, a horizon that simply stopped rather than curved away into more ocean. None of it was taken as settled fact by the more literate officers aboard, Pigafetta included, who treated most of it with the same skeptical curiosity he brought to everything else. But belief doesn't need universal agreement to shape behavior, and more than one sailor reportedly refused night watch duty near the ship's bow during the worst of the San Julian weather, convinced that whatever waited at the edge of a map like this one preferred to come for a man alone in the dark, rather than a man surrounded by his shipmates. Pigafetta didn't stop at physical description. He spent hours, by his own account, attempting to learn words of the Tehelcha language directly from the people he met on that shoreline, compiling what amounts to one of the earliest European word lists ever recorded for an indigenous South American language, a small, careful, genuinely scholarly act tucked inside a chapter that also includes an act of kidnapping he witnessed and recorded, without fully reckoning with. That contradiction sits at the center of almost everything Pigafetta wrote across this entire voyage. Real curiosity, real respect for what he encountered. Sitting uneasily alongside complete loyalty to a captain general and a mission that treated the people he was so carefully documenting as, when convenient, disposable. It's worth naming that tension honestly, rather than smoothing it over, because it's exactly the same tension running underneath most of what this whole voyage accomplished. It's worth understanding, too, what actually held a crew like this together through 5 months of cold, boredom, and simmering resentment. Because it wasn't sentiment. Every man aboard had signed formal articles back in Seville, laying out his share of whatever the voyage eventually returned. A system of compensation scaled by rank, but binding on captain general and cabin boy alike. Enforced by a quartermaster whose entire job was keeping that ledger honest, even when supplies ran short and tempers ran shorter. It's a strange kind of solidarity, built less on affection than on shared financial stake and a written contract. But it's real, and it's part of why this crew, fractured as it was by mutiny and hardship, kept largely functioning as a single unit rather than splintering entirely. A pirate crew a century later would formalize much the same idea into ship's articles of its own. This fleet was already living an early version of it, out of simple practical necessity, on a coastline that offered no other reason to stay loyal to anyone at all. By your 6th week at anchor, boredom has become its own kind of hazard. Officers muttering about the delay, sailors placing quiet, worried bets on whether this captain general actually knows where he's going, or is simply too stubborn to admit he doesn't. It's into exactly this atmosphere that something genuinely strange happens. A figure appears on the shoreline one morning, alone, singing and dancing and throwing dust over his own head in a gesture nobody aboard recognizes, before approaching close enough to trade. Pigafetta, who else, is right there with his notebook, and his description of the man is the reason this whole stretch of coastline still carries the name it does today. He describes the stranger as a giant, so tall that the tallest man aboard barely reached his waist, with feet so large and heavily wrapped in animal hide that the Spanish nicknamed the local people Patagones, roughly, big feet, a name that stuck to the entire region as Patagonia, and has outlived every single person who was actually there to witness the encounter. Here's where the historical caution has to come in, and it matters. Pigafetta's account of towering 9- and 10-foot giants is almost certainly exaggerated. The Tejelcia people who actually lived in this region were, by most modern estimates working from later, more careful measurements. Genuinely tall by contemporary European standards, plausibly 6 feet or more, on average, at a time when the typical European sailor stood closer to 5'4", which would have made for a startling, memorable difference in person. But nothing close to the folkloric giants that later mapmakers drew stomping across blank corners of the Patagonian coastline for the next 2 centuries. Treat the giants themselves as legend grown from a real and genuinely startling encounter, not as settled fact, which is exactly the distinction worth making any time this part of the story comes up. What happened next is where the encounter stops being merely strange and starts being genuinely hard to sit with. Magellan, according to Pigafetta's account, wanted to bring specimens of these remarkable people back to Spain as proof of what the expedition had found, living evidence for a royal court that would otherwise have to take his word for it. 2 Tejelcia men were lured aboard under false pretenses, offered iron leg shackles as gifts, ornaments to admire, and once their hands were busy examining the metal, the shackles were closed and locked. They were prisoners. Pigafetta records that both men wept and called out for a spirit they associated with their homeland when they realized what had happened, a detail that survives in his journal with an unusual note of discomfort, even from a chronicler generally loyal to the expedition. Both captives, given baptized names by the crew, remained aboard for the rest of the outward voyage. Neither survived it. Both died somewhere out on the Pacific crossing months later, weakened by the same scurvy and starvation that was already killing the sailors around them. Two men taken from the only home they'd ever known, and buried at sea in an ocean they had never asked to cross. That's not a footnote included for effect. It belongs here for the same reason the story keeps returning to named individuals rather than population totals. Because many died on this voyage as a statistic, and two men lured aboard with a pair of iron shackles, disguised as a gift, is a specific, documented, genuinely difficult piece of what this expedition actually cost, paid by people who never signed the ship's articles, never took a vote for captain, and never agreed to any of it in the first place. It sits uneasily alongside everything else in this chapter, and it should. The days themselves had been shrinking for weeks by this point, the way they do heading into a southern hemisphere winter, and by midwinter the sun barely cleared the surrounding hills before it was already sliding back down again, leaving something close to 16 hours of darkness to fill with whatever small tasks and smaller comforts a man could manage. Watches still had to be stood, regardless of how little daylight there was to stand them in, which meant long stretches of freezing, half-lit boredom broken only by the occasional relief of a hot meal or a shared story. Some of the crew, according to later testimony gathered back in Spain, took to carving small trinkets out of scrap wood and bone during these dark hours, combs, buttons, tiny figures, less for any practical use than for the simple, steadying discipline of having something to do with restless hands, while the wind kept howling outside. By your third month at anchor, the Santiago, the smallest of the 5 ships, had already been sent south to scout the coastline further ahead, searching for any sign of the strait Magellan kept insisting was out there somewhere. In mid-May, a sudden squall drove her onto rocks near a river the crew named Santa Cruz, and though every single man aboard survived, the ship herself was a total loss, timbers scattered along a beach, hundreds of miles from anyone who could help. 2 exhausted sailors made the trek back to San Julian on foot to report the wreck, a journey of roughly 11 days across frozen, unfamiliar terrain that reads, buried inside a chapter already full of larger events, as its own small, harrowing survival story. By August, 5 months after first dropping anchor, the fleet, now 4 ships instead of 5, finally weighed anchor and pushed further south, Cartagena and the mutinous priest left behind on the empty shore as the ships shrank to nothing on the horizon behind them. What waited ahead was the strait itself, still unproven, still theoretical, and the strangest, coldest 3 weeks of navigation the entire voyage would ask of anyone still aboard. That departure from San Julian didn't end the dread. If anything, it sharpened it. Every man aboard now knew exactly what their Captain General was capable of when questioned, and every man aboard was about to be asked to trust him with something considerably more frightening than a course correction. A passage nobody living had ever actually seen. The strait that nearly broke them 3 months after leaving San Julian in the 3rd week of October 1520. Lookouts on the lead ship spotted a gap in the coastline that didn't look like the dozens of false bays and dead-end inlets they'd already wasted weeks chasing. Magellan sent 2 ships ahead to scout it, the Concepcion and San Antonio, while the Trinidad and Victoria waited outside in open water in case the gap turned out to be another trap. A storm hit almost immediately. For 2 straight days, everyone aboard the waiting ships genuinely believed both scout ships were gone, smashed against rocks the same way the Santiago had been lost back in May. Then, on the 3rd day, both ships came sailing back out under full canvas. Flags run up, cannons firing salutes into a grey sky that had spent 2 days convinced it was watching a funeral. The storm hadn't wrecked them. It had blown them further inside the channel than they'd meant to go, and what they found in there wasn't a dead end at all. It kept going. Deep water, strong tidal currents running the wrong direction for a simple bay, and no bottom the lead line could reach. The entrance itself, a headland the fleet named Cape Virgins, after the church calendar's feast of the 11,000 virgins nearest the date of discovery, gave no obvious sign at first that it was anything more than another dead end. Low, windswept, unremarkable from open water, the kind of coastline the fleet had already sailed past dozens of disappointing times over the preceding 4 months. It's worth sitting with how easily this could have gone differently, had the storm that blew the scout ships inside never happened. Had Magellan's patience or his crew's dwindling tolerance for searching run out even 1 week earlier, this same unremarkable headland might simply have been logged, dismissed, and left behind like every other false lead on this coastline. And the entire remaining shape of this story, the Pacific crossing, the Philippines, Magellan's death, all of it, might never have happened at all. Or might have happened to some entirely different fleet, decades later, once someone else got lucky in the same storm. Magellan had found his strait. He named it, in that first burst of relief, the Strait of All Saints. For the church calendar's nearest feast day, it wouldn't carry his own name until decades after his death, once mapmakers started attaching it to the one man reckless enough to have gone looking. What lay ahead, though, was still roughly 350 miles of the strangest water any of these men had ever navigated, a maze of channels splitting and rejoining between towering, glacier-fed mountains. Tidal currents strong enough to fight a ship dead in the water, and nights so dark and so cold that the crews began calling the land to the south Tierra del Fuego, Land of Fire, for the scattered bonfires they could see burning on the shoreline every night, lit by indigenous peoples the fleet never directly encountered, but whose fires told them, unmistakably, that this frozen edge of the world wasn't actually empty. The strait itself, once the fleet actually committed to it, turned out to have a shape nobody could have guessed from outside. It narrowed almost immediately after the entrance into a passage the crew started calling the First Narrows, barely 2 miles wide with a tidal current so strong it could hold a ship dead still even under full sail, followed by a wider stretch of open water that briefly, cruelly looked like the passage might already be finished, before narrowing again into a second Narrows, just as punishing as the first. Between and around both of them, the land itself did something none of these Mediterranean and Atlantic-trained sailors had ever witnessed. Mountains rose directly out of the water on both sides, capped with ice, even though it was supposedly early summer in this hemisphere, feeding glaciers down into the channel that occasionally carved chunks of ice large enough to worry a lookout into ringing the ship's bell. Here's the thing, none of these men had a word yet for glacier, in the sense we'd use it now. What they had instead was a description in the log of mountains that bleed white water, which is, if you think about it for a second, a pretty solid description of exactly what a glacier does. The wildlife inside the strait gave the crew almost as much to marvel at as it did to fear. Pigafetta records seal colonies numbering in the thousands hauled out along certain stretches of rocky shoreline, their combined bark and roar audible from the ships well before the colonies themselves came into view, along with schools of a small, strange, flightless bird, the same penguins already noted further north at San Julin, dense enough in places that the water seemed to boil with them. There's a strange comfort tucked inside those descriptions, easy to miss under everything darker happening elsewhere in this chapter, even in the coldest, most punishing stretch of the entire voyage. In a channel that had already claimed one ship and would soon lose the San Antonio to desertion, the crew still found room in their exhausted attention for wonder at the sheer, indifferent abundance of a world that had never seen a European ship before, and had absolutely no idea one was passing through. By your second week inside the strait, the fleet had learned to navigate its false turns the hard way. The channel split constantly, throwing off narrower passages that looked promising for a day's sail before dead-ending against sheer rock, forcing a ship to back out and try again with daylight and patience both running short. Magellan sent smaller boats ahead of the main ships, wherever the channel narrowed enough to worry about running aground. Grim, cold, exhausting work for the men assigned to row and sound depth in freezing spray. One of whom, according to the muster records, was a young, able seaman who would go on to survive literally every other disaster this voyage still had waiting, and eventually stand on the deck of the Victoria 3 years later when she finally limped home, having rowed, by his own later account, more miles inside this one strait than most sailors covered in a full career. Clothing hadn't been designed for any of this either. Wool and linen suited to a Mediterranean or Atlantic crossing did almost nothing against wind funneling down off glaciers. And by the second week inside the strait, sailors were layering whatever spare canvas or scrap sailcloth they could scavenge just to keep the worst of the cold off exposed skin. Hands cracked and bled from the combination of cold, constant wet rope work, and salt. More than one man developed frostbite severe enough to threaten fingers and toes. Treated as best the barber surgeon could manage with whatever warmth and dry cloth could be found below decks. None of it killed anyone outright, the way scurvy or a mutineer's blade eventually would. It simply ground down every man aboard a little further, day after freezing day, adding its own quiet tax onto a crew that hadn't yet begun to imagine what still lay ahead of them on the far side of this passage. Rationing had already begun tightening well before anyone aboard understood just how badly it would need to stretch. 5 months at anchor in San Julian, however well the hunting parties had supplemented the ship's stores with guanaco and seal meat, hadn't done anything to replenish the biscuit and salted meat consumed getting there in the first place. And the officers overseeing distribution knew, even if they weren't saying it aloud to the ordinary crew, that whatever lay on the far side of this strait was still a complete unknown in terms of both distance and resupply. Portions shrank by degrees small enough that no single day felt like a crisis. A little less wine here, a slightly smaller biscuit ration there, the kind of gradual tightening that's almost more unsettling than a sudden cut, because it never gives you one clear moment to be afraid of. You just notice, one evening several weeks in, that you're hungrier than you remember being a month ago, without being able to point to the exact day it started. 3 weeks into the strait, with the fleet inching through channels barely wide enough for a ship to come about, San Antonio's pilot, a man named Estvo Gomes, who'd wanted this entire westward voyage commanded by someone other than a Portuguese defector in the first place, made a decision that had been building since San Julian. In the night, with the officer supposedly in charge of San Antonio confined to his cabin under suspicious circumstances that still aren't fully clear, Gomes turned the ship around and sailed back out the way they'd come, abandoning the fleet entirely and setting a course for home. He'd eventually make it back to Spain in May of 1521, arriving first, technically months before anyone else, and immediately told anyone who'd listen that Magellan and the rest of the fleet were almost certainly already dead. He wasn't wrong about the danger. He was wrong, as it turned out, about who exactly would live to prove him wrong. Before Gomes made his own private decision to desert, the question of whether to press on at all had already been raised formally, by men with considerably less to hide about it. Magellan called a council of his remaining pilots partway through the strait to weigh the option of turning back outright, now that a passage had technically been proven to exist but its far end remained completely unknown. An unusual gesture of consultation from a captain general who'd already demonstrated, in blood, exactly how he handled disagreement. The pilots were divided, several arguing for turning back while the fleet still had strength and provisions enough to make the return crossing safely. Magellan's answer, recorded by Pigafetta in something close to its original force even in translation, was that he intended to press on regardless of what lay ahead, even if it meant the crew were eventually reduced to eating the leather stripped from the ship's own yardarms. It's the kind of line that sounds like dramatic invention dressed up after the fact to look prophetic. It wasn't. Within 4 months, that exact leather really was what the crew was eating, which makes the remark considerably less like bravado and considerably more like a captain general who understood, with unsettling clarity, exactly what kind of gamble he'd already committed everyone aboard to. That left 3 ships to keep going: the Trinidad, the Victoria, and the Conception, down to somewhere around 200 men from an original 270, feeling their way through a strait that seemed to have no end, in water so cold the rigging iced over some mornings even as the crew's own summer, technically back in Europe, ticked past unseen. Here's the thing about hope on a voyage like this. It doesn't arrive as a single triumphant moment. It arrives in increments, the same way the danger had. A current that suddenly runs cleaner. Water that tastes less of glacier silt. A horizon, glimpsed from the crow's nest on a clear evening near the end of November, that doesn't show another headland closing the channel off. Just open water, stretching out flat and silver as far as anyone could see. Magellan's own conduct through these 3 weeks did a fair amount to hold the fleet together, whatever his critics aboard might otherwise have said about him. He reportedly kept a punishing personal schedule, moving between the ships by longboat to check soundings himself rather than relying entirely on subordinate reports. Present at enough of the actual scouting work that even sailors who resented him after San Julian had a harder time accusing him of recklessness with other men's lives, while sitting safely apart from the danger himself. It's a small but real distinction worth making. Whatever else can be said about his judgment, and plenty can, given everything still to come. Magellan wasn't a captain general who sent other men into danger he wasn't willing to share. That's not the same as being right. It's also not nothing to the men who had to trust him with their lives regardless. Magellan reportedly wept when he saw it. The detail survives through Pigafetta, who was standing close enough to witness it, and unusual enough about a captain general not given to visible emotion that it made it into the record at all. He named that ocean the Pacific, Mar Pacifico, the peaceful sea, for how calm it looked after 5 weeks fighting a strait that had tried to kill them a dozen different ways. It's one of history's better documented ironies that this exact name, chosen in a moment of genuine relief on the 28th of November 1520, would end up attached to the very stretch of water that came closest to finishing every single man aboard. It's worth trying to imagine, for a moment, what that first sight of open water actually meant to men who had no real concept yet of how large an ocean could be. European sailors of this era had crossed the Atlantic, a formidable but by now reasonably charted distance. Nothing in their training or experience prepared them to look out at a horizon and correctly guess that what lay beyond it was roughly twice the width of anything they'd ever sailed before. Magellan's own relief, real as it clearly was, rested on an assumption about scale that simply hadn't been tested yet. The confident belief of a man who had found one impossible thing and, understandably, assumed the hardest part must therefore already be behind him. It wasn't. It hadn't even properly started yet. The western mouth of the strait itself Magellan named Cape Deseado, Cape Desired, a small, plain, entirely honest label for the thing every exhausted man aboard had been praying to see for 3 straight weeks. Magellan believed, based on the maps and calculations he'd built this entire voyage around, that the Spice Islands lay perhaps a few weeks' sail further west. He was off by a margin that's almost impossible to overstate. What actually lay ahead of the 3 remaining ships was the largest ocean on the planet, roughly 64 million square miles of it. Wider than anyone in Europe had any working concept for, and the crossing they were about to attempt would take not a few weeks, but very nearly 100 days, through water so thoroughly empty of land that men would start eating the ship itself just to survive it. That crossing is where this story goes next, and it's the last long stretch of the voyage Magellan himself would live to see all the way through. 98 days of nothing, the Pacific crossing didn't announce itself as catastrophe on day one. It rarely does. Picture the deck of the Trinidad on a clear morning in early December 1520. Mild air for once, the strait's brutal cold finally behind you, the ocean living up to its brand new name with a flatness that almost feels like a reward. Somewhere below, Pigafetta is cataloguing a flying fish nobody on board has a name for, delighted the way only a scholar 4,000 miles from home can be delighted. It feels, for about 2 weeks, like the worst of the voyage might already be over. Navigation out here worked almost entirely by guesswork dressed up as mathematics. Dead reckoning, the standard method of the era, meant estimating your position from your last known point using compass heading, estimated speed, measured by throwing a knotted rope over the side and counting how fast it paid out, which is genuinely where the nautical term knots comes from, and the time elapsed, tracked by a ship's boy turning a half-hour sandglass around the clock, day and night. An unglamorous job that nonetheless kept an entire fleet oriented in an ocean, with no other reference points at all. What none of these instruments could do was measure longitude, how far east or west you'd actually travelled, a problem that wouldn't be properly solved for another 2.5 centuries. Every single estimate of how far the fleet had come, and how much further the Spice Islands might be, was built on compounding guesswork, which is a large part of why Magellan's confident prediction of a short Pacific crossing turned out to be so catastrophically wrong. He wasn't reckless. He was navigating with the best tools his century had, and those tools simply weren't good enough for an ocean this size. Christmas came and went somewhere out on that empty water in late December of 1520, marked, according to the ship's log, with what small ceremony the crew could manage. A mass said on deck. Whatever modestly better ration the officers could authorize for the occasion. And, one imagines, more than a little quiet homesickness among men who'd now spent their second consecutive Christmas away from anyone they loved, with no particular confidence they'd see a third. It's easy to let a story like this one become pure hardship, and forget that these were men who still marked holy days, still prayed, still tried to hold on to some small ritual of normal life even 4,000 miles from the nearest thing resembling home. That impulse to keep some fragment of ordinary life going even in the middle of genuine catastrophe shows up again and again across this voyage, and it's as much a part of how 18 of them eventually made it home as any single decision Magellan made. By your third week on this ocean, that feeling is gone completely. And here's why. Magellan's charts, built on second-hand information and a wildly optimistic estimate of the Pacific's size, gave him no reason to load extra provisions before leaving the strait behind. 3 ships, roughly 190 men between them, sailing into an ocean he genuinely believed was a matter of weeks wide, with the same rationed food that had already been stretched thin for over a year. By the time it became obvious the ocean simply wasn't ending, no islands, no landfall, nothing but horizon repeating itself day after identical day, there was no way to correct course on provisions. You can't grow more biscuit in open water. You can only watch what's left of it disappear. Here's what the 98 days between leaving the strait and finally sighting land actually looked like, and the details survive almost entirely because Pigafetta refused to stop writing even as things got difficult to write about. The biscuit, already weevil-infested before the crossing even began, turned to what he later described as powder full of worms and fouled by rat urine, the rats having gotten into the stores and ruined far more than they ate. Men ate it anyway. When that ran out, the crew turned to sawdust, scraped from the ship's own timbers and choked down for whatever meager nutrition it might offer. When even that felt insufficient, they cut strips of oxhide from the yard arms, leather that had been used to reinforce the rigging, gone stiff as board from months of sun and salt spray, and soaked it in seawater for 4 or 5 days at a stretch, just to soften it enough to gnaw through. Then roasted it over coals before eating it. Rats, once a black market luxury bought and sold for coin back in the Atlantic, became a genuine delicacy men would have paid considerably more than a fair price for. Had there been anyone left with spare coin and any rats left to sell? By your 6th week without landfall, scurvy had arrived in earnest, and scurvy on a ship in 1521 wasn't understood as a disease at all. Nobody yet knew it was a vitamin deficiency, that fresh fruit could have stopped it cold, that the answer had been sitting unnoticed in citrus groves the entire time. What the crew actually saw was gums swelling until they covered the teeth entirely, making it impossible to eat even the meager rations that remained. Old wounds, a scar from a Portuguese campaign 15 years back, a rope burn from 3 weeks ago, reopened on their own, refusing to heal. Joints ached with a deep, grinding pain that made climbing the rigging agony and standing watch nearly unbearable. Pigafetta records that 19 men died during this crossing, most of them from scurvy, their bodies committed to an ocean with no land in any direction to bury them on instead. Both of the Tehelsha men taken captive back at San Julián died somewhere on this same stretch of water, still shackled, still thousands of miles from a coastline they'd never see again. Time marker, by day 60 of the crossing, with the ration down to almost nothing, and morale lower than it had been even in the frozen weeks navigating the strait, Magellan made the calculated decision to keep the fleet's course steady, rather than veer in search of the smaller, likely uninhabited islands his charts hinted might lie somewhat to the north or south. It was a bet on discipline over desperation, and it very nearly killed everyone aboard. Here's the thing worth sitting with for a moment rather than rushing past. This is the register where the strongest version of this story lives. Not in the mutiny, not even in the battle still ahead, but in 98 days of men choking down leather off their own rigging, while their Captain General kept the fleet pointed at a horizon that refused, week after week, to show them anything but more horizon. There's a particular kind of fear that comes from an ocean being too calm rather than too violent, and this crossing produced plenty of it. Magellan had named this sea for its peacefulness, and for week after week that peacefulness held no storms, no violent seas, nothing to actively fight against. Which sounds like mercy until you're the one living inside it. A storm at least gives a crew something to do, some enemy to work against together. What this ocean offered instead was flat, glassy, endless quiet, day after day of near-identical horizon, the kind of monotony that let dread creep in sideways rather than announce itself. Pigafetta records the strange psychological toll of it almost as vividly as he records the physical suffering. Men staring for hours at a horizon that never changed, growing superstitious about the ocean's stillness itself, wondering aloud whether they'd somehow sailed into a becalmed trap they'd never escape, rather than simply crossing a very large, very empty body of water. The ship's logs from this stretch, fragments of which survive alongside Pigafetta's more personal account, record deaths with a clipped, business-like brevity that somehow makes them land harder rather than softer. A name, a date, occasionally a cause. Nothing more. No eulogy, no ceremony beyond whatever brief prayer the crew could manage before a body went over the side into water, so deep no sailor aboard could have told you, even approximately, how far down it might sink before it stopped. That business-like brevity wasn't coldness so much as necessity. A crew this reduced, this exhausted, working watches with barely enough healthy hands to manage the sails, simply couldn't afford to stop and grieve properly every single time, and so grief itself became something rationed alongside the water and the biscuit, doled out in whatever small moments the work allowed. There's a small human detail worth pulling out of the general misery here. because abstract suffering is easy to describe and hard to actually feel. A young ship's boy, the muster records list several teenagers aboard the fleet. Boys as young as 13 or 14 signed on as servants and pages. Spent this crossing doing the unglamorous work nobody older wanted. Hauling the softened leather up from where it soaked. Running messages between decks too narrow for grown men to move quickly through. And, according to Pigafetta's account, sharing whatever small portion of biscuit he still had left with an officer who'd fallen too sick with scurvy to chew even the softened leather himself. It's not a grand act. It's not the kind of thing that gets a statue built later. It's just one exhausted, hungry boy deciding another man's hunger mattered too. 4,000 miles from anywhere either of them had ever called home. Small kindnesses like that one are easy to lose in a story built around a captain general's decisions and a strait's discovery. They shouldn't be. By day 70 or so, with fresh water rationed down to a few mouthfuls a day and men too weak with scurvy to climb the rigging without help, morale had cratered to the point that even the ship's officers began openly wondering, in the log entries that survive, whether the fleet would simply be found one day drifting. Every man aboard dead, a ghost armada with no one left to steer it toward whatever coastline eventually appeared. It's the kind of dread that doesn't build toward a single dramatic moment. It just sits there, day after day, thickening. There was, by most accounts, one especially bad stretch around this point where discipline nearly broke entirely. A handful of the most desperate sailors reportedly approached Magellan directly, arguing that the fleet should abandon its westward course and turn back for the strait while any of them still had the strength to sail it, rather than press onward into an ocean that showed no sign of ever ending. Magellan refused, as he'd refused every challenge to his authority since the day the fleet left Spain. And here the refusal reads differently than it did at San Julian, less like a captain general defending his pride, and more like a man who understood, correctly as it turned out, that a fleet this weakened would never survive recrossing the distance they'd already covered, and that the only real chance of survival left was the one lying somewhere ahead, unseen, unconfirmed, and running out of days to appear. Feast days on the church calendar kept arriving throughout the crossing, regardless of how little the crew had left to mark them with, and the log entries that survive suggest the officers made a point of observing what they could. A mass said with whatever remained of the sacramental wine. A saint's day noted even when there was nothing extra to eat in its honor. It's tempting to read that as empty ritual, going through motions that couldn't possibly matter against the scale of what the crew was actually suffering. The men living through it seemed to have felt otherwise. A fixed calendar, arriving on schedule regardless of how lost and hungry everyone felt, was one of the only things left aboard those 3 ships that hadn't been disrupted by the ocean's refusal to end. A small, stubborn thread of normal, structured time running underneath 98 days that otherwise felt like they might never resolve into anything at all. Land, when it finally came, arrived almost cruelly. Not the lush, provision-rich landfall the crew had been imagining for weeks, but a small island in what's now the Mariana chain, sighted on the 6th of March, 1521. Roughly 98 days after leaving the strait behind. The people living there met the exhausted fleet not with the desperate gratitude the crew half expected from themselves, but with brisk, confident trading, until several items went missing from one of the ships, at which point Magellan's men opened fire on the departing canoes and burned several houses ashore in retaliation, killing at least 7 local men in an exchange that reads, from any honest distance, considerably worse for the fleet side of the story than for the islanders. Pigafetta's notebook from this stretch isn't only a ledger of suffering, it's also full of a scholar's genuine attempt to catalogue a world that didn't match anything in his training. Flying fish that seemed to leap clear out of the water and glide for improbable distances. phosphorescent trails in the ship's wake on the darkest nights, glowing faintly enough that more than one superstitious sailor took them as an omen before Pigafetta talked himself into a calmer, more naturalistic explanation involving some property of the water itself he couldn't otherwise account for. Two constellations, visible only from this far south, that he sketched and described as carefully as his failing supplies of ink allowed, in what amounts to one of the earliest European recordings of stars later charted as the Magellanic Clouds, named, eventually, for the very voyage that first brought them into a wider record, though Magellan himself would never learn that either. The Spanish named the place the Islas de los Ladrones, the Islands of Thieves, a label that stuck on European maps for over 2 centuries and says considerably more about the fear and exhaustion driving that violence than it does about the people who actually lived there. Worth pausing on the asymmetry here for a moment. To islanders living their ordinary lives on a small Pacific landmass, a handful of missing trinkets from a fleet of gaunt, hollow-eyed strangers, probably registered as an unremarkable, almost forgettable afternoon. To the fleet, 98 days into starvation and half out of their minds, with relief at seeing land at all, it registered as betrayal severe enough to justify cannon fire and burning houses. Both reactions came from the same collision of two people, with absolutely no shared context for understanding the other, and only one side of that collision had guns. Not every landing in this story is going to be a good one. This wasn't. 10 days later, on the 16th of March, 1521, lookouts sighted a genuinely different set of islands. Green, mountainous, populated by people who greeted the ragged fleet with fresh fruit, fish, and something the starving crew hadn't tasted in over 3 months: relief. This was the Philippine archipelago, though nobody aboard used that name yet. And it's here, recovering, resupplying, and about to meet a local ruler who would change the entire remaining course of the voyage. That Magellan's own personal story is going to reach its ending. What happens over these next several weeks is the exact turning point this whole chapter has been building toward. The part where the man who planned this voyage stops being the one telling it. Cebu and the Blood Compact. Landfall in the Philippines gave the fleet something it hadn't had in over 3 months: a full stop. Fresh coconuts, roasted fish, and clean water on the small island of Homenhon, where the crew spent over a week simply recovering before pressing further into the archipelago. And it's here that a detail surfaces which genuinely startled the fleet at the time. Enrique, Magellan's Malay interpreter, purchased years earlier during Magellan's service in Southeast Asia, discovered he could understand the local language well enough to communicate. If that's accurate, and most historians treat it as broadly credible, even if the exact linguistic mechanics are debated, it meant Enrique had just become, quite possibly, the first person in recorded history to circle the entire globe and arrive back somewhere close enough to home to be understood, years before the ships themselves would ever complete that same circle. Worth sitting with for a second, a man taken as a slave on one side of the world may have just closed a circumnavigation on foot mid-voyage, while everyone around him was still congratulating themselves on merely surviving an ocean crossing. This is also the stretch of the voyage where Enrique's role shifted from a background detail to something close to indispensable. Every negotiation, every gift exchanged, every alliance sealed from this point forward ran through his translation, which meant a man who'd spent the better part of the voyage as an unremarked-upon possession was, for these few crucial weeks, arguably the single most important person aboard either ship. The only bridge between a captain general who couldn't speak a word of the local language and rulers who held the fleet's survival, quite literally, in their hands. It's worth noticing how quickly that dependence formed, and how completely it would evaporate again the moment it stopped being convenient. which is exactly what happens to Enrique in a few weeks' time. The fleet's first real diplomatic contact in the archipelago came a few days later at the small island of Limasawa, where a local ruler named Raja Kalambu welcomed the ships warmly, traded gold and provisions freely, and on Easter Sunday, the 31st of March 1521, hosted what's now generally recognized as the first Catholic Mass ever celebrated on Philippine soil, a moment still formally commemorated in the Philippines today, 5 centuries later, which is its own small proof of how far this story's ripples actually traveled. Kalambu himself, by several accounts, joined the crew in worship without fully converting, more an act of hospitality and curiosity than religious commitment, and offered to personally guide the fleet onward to a larger, wealthier port he knew of nearby, Cebu. Before any of that, though, Kalambu had already sealed his own blood compact with Magellan days earlier, in what appears to have been the fleet's very first experience of the ritual that would later define the alliance at Cebu: a small cut to the arm, a few drops of blood mixed into shared wine, and a bond that, on this particular island, actually held. Magellan's men spent several days at Limasawa afterward simply resting and trading, exchanging red caps, mirrors and knives for rice, coconuts, and roasted pork, the ordinary sailors getting their first real chance in over 3 months to sit on solid ground, eat food that hadn't been rationed by the spoonful, and remember, if only briefly, what an unhurried afternoon actually felt like. By the 7th of April 1521, the fleet had made its way to Cebu, guided there by Kalambu just as promised. Cebu's ruler, Raja Humabon, met the arriving ships with an entourage, a formal audience, and, after some initial posturing on both sides about tribute and trade rights that Magellan handled with a mixture of diplomacy and a not-so-subtle demonstration of Spanish cannon fire, an alliance. The two men sealed it the way alliances were sealed across much of maritime Southeast Asia at the time. A blood compact, sandugo, in which both parties cut their arms and mixed a few drops of blood into shared cups of wine, drinking to a bond meant to be unbreakable. The negotiations leading up to that alliance weren't quite as smooth as the eventual blood compact makes them sound. Humabon's court initially demanded the standard tribute any foreign ship anchoring off Cebu was expected to pay, the same arrangement other traders, mostly Chinese and Arab merchants who'd been calling at this port for generations, had always accepted without complaint. Magellan, through an intermediary, who explained that this was a royal fleet answering to no one's tribute but its own king's, declined and backed the refusal with a demonstration that did more diplomatic work than any speech could have. He ordered his gunners to fire the ship's cannons out over open water, the sound alone enough to visibly unsettle Humabon's entourage, followed by a display of Spanish soldiers in full armor moving through a brief mock skirmish on deck, swords catching the sun. It worked exactly as intended. Within a day, tribute was off the table entirely, replaced instead by the framework for an alliance between equals, or at least an alliance both sides found it convenient to describe that way. This is the story of a captain general who had just crossed the largest ocean on Earth on rations of leather and sawdust, and within days of landfall had talked his way into becoming genuine political allies with a local king, which sounds, on paper, like the turning point where everything finally starts going right. What followed over the next week reads, from a modern vantage, as something closer to a fever than a diplomatic mission. Magellan pressed his advantage hard, and Humabon, whether out of genuine spiritual conviction, shrewd political calculation about which side of a coming regional power shift to align with, or some blend of both that the sources simply can't fully untangle, agreed to be baptized as a Christian, taking the name Carlos in honor of the Spanish king. His wife was baptized too, given the name Juana, and received, as a personal gift from Magellan, a small carved statue of the Christ child that the fleet had carried all the way from Spain. That statue, known today as the Santo Niño de Cebu, reportedly survived a fire that destroyed the settlement decades later, was recovered from the ashes, and remains enshrined in Cebu City to this day. An actual physical object you can still stand in front of 500 years after Pigafetta watched it, handed over as a wedding gift between two allied rulers who'd known each other for less than a week. Alongside the baptisms, Magellan reportedly had his men plant a large wooden cross on a hill overlooking the settlement, marking the alliance and the conversions with a physical monument meant to outlast the fleet's own presence in the islands. It did, in a fashion nobody at the time could have predicted. A cross still stands at that same site, in what's now Cebu City today, housed inside a small octagonal chapel built specifically to protect it, and while historians generally agree the original wood has long since been replaced or encased for preservation, the location and the tradition have been maintained continuously enough that it remains one of the most visited historical sites in the entire Philippines. A direct, physical thread connecting a hillside in 1521 to a city block that tourists walk through 5 centuries later, entirely unaware, most of them, of the starving fleet and the desperate Captain General who put it there. Over the course of roughly 10 days, somewhere between 500 and 800 of Cebu's residents followed their ruler's lead and were baptized as well, a mass conversion that Pigafetta records with evident wonder, and that historians today read with considerably more caution. Genuine religious change, coerced political theatre, or some mixture the participants themselves might not have cleanly separated at the time. What's documented without much dispute is the scale of it, an entire island's ruling structure formally allying itself with Spain in the space of about 10 days, cemented with baptismal water, blood, and a healthy dose of intimidating Spanish artillery fire during the initial negotiations. Pigafetta also records, and this is exactly the kind of detail that belongs firmly in the according to legend category rather than settled history, that an elderly relative of Humabon's household who had been gravely ill recovered shortly after Christian prayers were said over him, a recovery the fleet's chroniclers naturally attributed to divine favor, and which reportedly did a great deal to accelerate the pace of conversion among an already receptive population. Illness recoveries happen with or without prayer, of course, and a Venetian nobleman recording a miracle second-hand 3 weeks after crossing an entire ocean is not exactly a neutral witness. Still, true or not, the story itself clearly mattered to the people telling it at the time, which is its own kind of historical fact worth preserving alongside whatever medically actually happened. Pigafetta also records, Pigafetta describes the baptismal ceremonies themselves, with the kind of pageantry-obsessed detail only a nobleman raised around European court ritual would bother recording. A wooden platform built specially for the occasion, draped in cloth. Humabon led up under a canopy carried by his own attendants, the assembled crowd kneeling in rows as Spanish priests worked through baptism after baptism under the tropical heat. There's a political undercurrent running beneath all that pageantry worth naming honestly. Cebu wasn't an isolated, unified kingdom, simply waiting for outside validation. It sat inside a web of rival island chiefdoms, trade rivalries, and shifting local alliances that had existed for generations before any Spanish ship arrived. And Humabon's enthusiastic embrace of this new foreign alliance made considerably more sense once you understand he was also, quite plainly, using it to strengthen his own position against rival chiefs nearby. Lapu-Lapu on Mactan chief among them. Magellan, in other words, hadn't stumbled into a simple story of conversion and friendship. He'd stepped, mostly without realizing it, straight into the middle of somebody else's ongoing regional power struggle, and was about to become one of its casualties. The trading itself, once relations warmed past that initial cannon fire standoff, gave the crew their first real look at just how wrong Europe's assumptions about this part of the world had been. Humabon's court dealt in gold jewelry, porcelain imported from China, silk, and spices that had clearly been passing through a sophisticated regional trade network for generations before any Spanish ship arrived, a level of material wealth and craftsmanship that startled sailors who'd been raised to think of themselves as arriving somewhere remote and undeveloped. Pigafetta records his own fascination in detail. Gold weighed openly and traded without the anxious secrecy Europeans might have shown handling the same quantities. Porcelain dishes handled with a casualness that suggested genuine local abundance rather than rare luxury. It's a small but important corrective to the version of this story where European sailors arrived to enlighten a simpler world. What they actually arrived at Cebu, was a wealthy, complex, thoroughly interconnected trading society that had simply never had reason to send its own ships west to introduce itself first. For the ordinary sailors, not the officers negotiating alliances, but the men who'd spent 2 years hauling rope and choking down leather, Cebu offered something the entire voyage had almost never given them. An extended stretch of genuinely pleasant daily life among people who, for these few weeks at least, treated them as welcome guests, rather than threats to be managed. Trade along the waterfront ran daily and informally. A knife or a mirror for a basket of fruit, a length of red cloth for fresh fish. Small transactions that had nothing to do with royal alliances or religious conversion. And everything to do with two groups of ordinary people figuring out, item by item, what the other side actually valued. Several accounts mention sailors picking up small amounts of the local language purely through repeated bartering, learning words for common foods and everyday objects, long before any formal effort at translation beyond Enrique's own work. It's easy, telling a story this dense with disaster, to lose the fact that for roughly 3 weeks at Cebu, this exhausted, grieving, badly reduced crew got to simply live somewhere pleasant for a while, and by every surviving account, they knew exactly how rare that was, and made the most of it. Here's the thing about momentum like that, though. It makes a man start believing his own luck is a permanent condition rather than a run that's due to end. Humabon, newly baptized and newly allied, mentioned to Magellan that one nearby chieftain on the small island of Mactan just across the strait from Cebu was refusing to submit to the new arrangement or pay the tribute the other local rulers had agreed to. That chieftain's name was Lapu-Lapu. Magellan, riding a wave of confidence built on a blood pact, several hundred baptisms, and a Pacific crossing he'd somehow survived against genuinely terrible odds, decided this was a problem he could solve personally, quickly, and with a relatively small show of force. He would be wrong on every count. It's worth remembering that Humabon was taking a real gamble of his own in all of this, not simply receiving a foreign fleet's generosity. Aligning openly with a small, strange group of newly arrived outsiders, adopting their religion publicly, and pressuring neighboring chiefs to fall in line behind that new alliance, was a genuine political risk in a region where reputations and rivalries ran deep and long. If the Spanish fleet turned out to be weak, or left as suddenly as it arrived, Humabon would be the one left standing among neighbors who'd watched him bend the knee to a handful of exhausted foreigners with fewer than 200 men between them. That risk is part of what makes his eventual pivot after Mactan more understandable than it might first appear. Not simple treachery, but a ruler recalculating in real time whether the gamble he'd made was still worth the exposure it had cost him. There's a quiet undercurrent of hope worth naming here before this story turns dark again, because it's easy to lose under everything that's coming. Whatever the mixture of coercion and genuine conviction behind those baptisms, the alliance itself was, for a handful of days, a real and mutually chosen thing. a Cebuano king-and-a-half-dead Portuguese sailor, representing two civilizations that had never previously had reason to know the other existed, choosing partnership over conquest, when conquest was well within reach. It didn't hold. Almost nothing on this voyage held for very long, but it happened, briefly, and it's worth letting that stand on its own before the story moves on to the beach where it started falling apart. And what happened next, on that beach at Mactan, in water too shallow for his own ships to properly support him, is where Ferdinand Magellan's part in this voyage ends, roughly a year and a half into a journey he'd planned to lead, from start to finish, the Battle of Mactan. The night before, Magellan sent an emissary across the strait with an ultimatum: submit to Spanish authority and the new Christian alliance now governing Cebu, pay the tribute the other local chiefs had already accepted, or expect an armed landing at dawn. Lapu-Lapu's response, relayed back and recorded second-hand through Pigafetta, was defiant rather than desperate. He reportedly told the messenger that his people had spears too, made of fire-hardened bamboo, and would be waiting. It's a small detail, easy to skip past, but it's worth noticing. This wasn't a ruler caught off guard by a threat he didn't understand. Lapu-Lapu knew exactly what was coming, had a full night to prepare his warriors and his beach defenses accordingly, and chose to stand anyway. Whatever else gets said about the battle that followed, it wasn't a surprise attack on either side. The morning of the 27th of April 1521 arrived clear and hot over the strait between Cebu and Mactan, and it very nearly didn't happen at all. Raja Humabon reportedly offered Magellan several hundred of his own warriors to help settle the dispute with Lapu-Lapu and Magellan, in a decision historians still puzzle over, turned the offer down. He wanted this handled by his own men, a demonstration of Spanish strength rather than a joint operation that might read as leaning on local allies. It was, in hindsight, the first of several choices that morning that reads less like strategy and more like a man who'd survived so much already that he'd started to believe survival was simply a habit he'd formed. He led roughly 60 armored men across the strait in small boats before dawn, expecting to overwhelm Lapu-Lapu's forces with superior European weaponry and the simple shock of gunfire, a tactic that had worked, more or less at Cebu, just weeks earlier. What he hadn't accounted for was the coral reef ringing Mactan's shoreline, which kept his boats grounded well offshore, far outside the effective range of the ship's cannons anchored further out in deeper water. His men had to wade in, some of them chest deep, weapons held above the waterline, crossing what accounts describe as several hundred yards of open shallows before they even reached dry sand. Waiting for them on that beach, according to the sources, and the numbers here vary considerably depending on which account you trust, with figures ranging from around 1,500 up to several thousand, was a force of Mactan warriors under Lapu-Lapu that outnumbered Magellan's landing party by something like 20 or 30 to 1. It's worth understanding exactly why the technology gap that had worked so well at Cebu utterly failed to matter here. Spanish crossbows and early matchlock firearms were genuinely more powerful per shot than anything Lapu-Lapu's warriors carried. But they were also slow to reload, next to useless once soaked by a chest-deep wade through the surf, and only as effective as the range at which they could actually be fired. Cannon fire from the ships, which had done so much diplomatic work back at Cebu, simply couldn't reach the beach at all, blocked by the same reef that had already forced Magellan's men out of their boats hundreds of yards from dry land. What that left was close quarters, fighting between 60 tired, waterlogged men in heavy steel and roughly 10 times that many warriors on their own home ground, fighting with weapons perfectly suited to exactly this kind of combat. Superior technology, it turns out, only wins battles it's actually allowed to be used the way it's designed for. Partway through the fighting, in what later reads as one more compounding mistake in a morning already full of them, Magellan reportedly ordered a portion of his own small force to peel off and set fire to several houses along the shoreline, intended, presumably, as a show of overwhelming force that might break the defenders' resolve the way cannon fire had worked at Cebu weeks earlier. It had the opposite effect entirely. Rather than intimidating Lapu-Lapu's warriors into retreat, the burning homes seemed to have enraged them further, and accounts suggest the fighting actually intensified in its immediate aftermath, with more warriors joining the fray rather than fewer. It's a small tactical detail, easy to lose inside the larger sweep of the battle, but it says something important about the whole encounter. Magellan was improvising, mid-fight, using a playbook built from a very different negotiation days earlier, on very different terms, against people who had already decided overnight that this particular show of force wasn't going to work on them. The fighting that followed lasted roughly an hour, which doesn't sound like much until you picture 60 exhausted men, already soaked and slowed by their crossing, trying to hold a beach against a force that size, using swords and crossbows against warriors wielding bamboo spears, fire-hardened stakes, and, critically, a home field advantage on terrain their attackers had never set foot on before. Magellan's armor, which had protected him through campaigns in India and Morocco, held against most blows to his torso. It didn't protect his legs. A poisoned arrow found his unarmored calf early in the fighting. He kept fighting anyway. Then a bamboo spear struck him in the face, and shortly after, according to Pigafetta, who watched this unfold from one of the boats, still grounded offshore, close enough to see it clearly, and far enough away to be entirely unable to help, a native warrior drove a large cutlass-like blade into Magellan's leg, and he went down into the surf. Magellan himself was no longer, by this point in the voyage, the young man who'd fought at Malacca and Azamor a decade earlier. He was somewhere past 40, still walking with the limp Morocco had left him, worn down by 2 years of exactly the same starvation and exhaustion that had killed 19 of his own men crossing the Pacific. None of that shows up much in the more heroic retellings of Macton, which tend to picture him as invincible right up until the moment he wasn't. The more accurate picture is a middle-aged man, already carrying old injuries, already worn thin by a voyage that had cost him everything he had left to give, choosing to wade chest deep into a fight anyway, rather than send men in ahead of him. Whatever else that choice says about his judgment that morning, it doesn't say anything about cowardice. Here's the detail that tends to stop people the longest in the retelling. Magellan reportedly ordered his own men not to attempt his rescue, apparently trying to buy time for the rest of the landing party to retreat to the boats, rather than risk more lives trying to save one. His own. Whether he actually said anything resembling that, in the chaos of a beach battle with an arrow already in his leg, is impossible to confirm with certainty. Pigafetta's account is the source, written by a man loyal to him, watching from a distance, under conditions about as far from calm observation as a scene can get. What's not in dispute is the outcome. Magellan's own men were forced to retreat without him. His body was never recovered. Lapu-Lapu's warriors kept it, refusing every subsequent offer of ransom, and to this day nobody knows what became of it. Back aboard the ships, anchored just offshore in water too shallow for them to close the distance and provide covering fire, the remaining crew watched most of this unfold at a helpless remove, close enough to see figures moving and falling on the beach, too far to make out individual faces, and entirely unable to do anything but wait for the surviving members of the landing party to reach the boats and be hauled, exhausted and bleeding, back over the gunwales. Several of the men who made it back were wounded badly enough that the ship's surgeon worked through the night treating cuts and puncture wounds by lamplight, while officers argued in low voices about whether any further attempt should be made to recover the Captain General's body. It was decided, grimly and pragmatically, that it shouldn't. Not that night. And, as it turned out, not ever. Humabon himself reportedly offered to intervene diplomatically on the fleet's behalf. But whatever leverage he might once have had with Lapu-Lapu had likely been undercut by the very defeat Magellan had just suffered in front of the entire regional audience. It's worth pausing, too, on the sheer strangeness of how small this fight actually was in absolute terms, set against everything it changed. 60 men. An hour, give or take. A beach most of the participants on either side could have walked the length of in a few unhurried minutes. History doesn't require grand scale to pivot on a hinge. This is a battle smaller than a modern schoolyard dispute in headcount, fought over a tribute payment that in monetary terms probably wouldn't have covered a fraction of what the fleet had already spent on wine. And it ended the life of the one man whose vision, stubbornness, and occasionally brutal decisiveness had carried this expedition from a proposal on paper all the way to the edge of the one archipelago that could still make the entire voyage a triumph rather than a catastrophe. Small causes, enormous consequences. That imbalance is going to keep showing up for the rest of this story. Enrique, Magellan's interpreter, was reportedly among the landing party that day and survived the retreat back to the boats. Wounded, but alive. Which matters, because within days, what Enrique does or doesn't do next is going to shape everything that happens to the rest of this crew. But that's the following chapter's story. For now, the beach at Mactan simply goes quiet, the tide slowly erasing whatever marks the fighting left in the sand, and a captain general who had planned this entire voyage survived a mutiny, discovered a strait nobody else had found, and crossed the largest ocean on Earth on a diet of leather and sawdust. Lies dead in water he chose to attack against the advice of the very allies who'd offered to help him avoid it. It's worth pausing here, at the exact hinge point of this entire story, on how strange and how ordinary this death actually was. Not a grand final battle against overwhelming odds for some world historical prize. A dispute over local tribute, on a beach most of Europe would never have heard of if things had gone even slightly differently, against a local ruler defending exactly what any of us would defend, his own home. From a stranger who'd arrived with cannons and demanded submission. Lapu-Lapu is remembered very differently on the other side of that beach. In the Philippines today, he's commemorated as the first local leader to successfully resist European conquest. A city bears his name. A national holiday marks the anniversary of the battle, and statues of him stand in more than one Filipino city, facing outward toward the same strait his warriors defended 500 years ago. One of those statues, in Rizal Park in Manila, has stood as a national landmark since the mid-20th century, cast in bronze, spear raised, facing out toward the exact direction the Spanish fleet would have approached from. A permanent, physical answer to a story that, for centuries, only Europe got to tell. Two men, two entirely different endings to the same hour of fighting, and both of them still being remembered, on opposite sides of the world's understanding of what actually happened that morning. Word of what actually happened that morning took an almost absurdly long time to reach the rest of the world, which is worth sitting with for a moment given how instantly news travels now. Estvo Gomes, having deserted back through the Strait months earlier, had already reached Spain by May of 1521, the very same month Magellan died, though Gomes had no way of knowing that, spreading his own confident prediction that the entire fleet was surely lost by now, somewhere out past the edge of any known chart. He was, by pure coincidence, closer to right than he could have possibly known, though not in the way he meant it. The actual, confirmed news of Magellan's death didn't reach Spain until the Victoria herself limped into Sanlúcar more than a year later, which means, for the better part of 18 months, nobody back home, not Magellan's wife, not the crown that had funded the voyage, not a single soul in Europe, had any reliable idea whether the man who'd promised them a straight and a shortcut to the Spice Islands was alive, dead, lost, or triumphant. That's the kind of silence this whole voyage kept generating, over and over. Entire chapters of catastrophe and consequence playing out on the far side of the world, invisible to everyone who cared most, for months and sometimes years at a stretch. There's a particular kind of unfinished grief that comes from never having a body to bury, and it's worth naming plainly here, rather than letting the battle's larger drama swallow it. European burial custom of the period placed enormous weight on a proper Christian burial, consecrated ground, last rites, a marked grave a family could eventually visit. Magellan got none of it. His crew, forced to retreat without him, had no funeral to hold beyond whatever prayers could be said aboard ship that same night. No grave to mark. Nothing physical left behind to grieve over beyond the empty space where their Captain General used to stand. That absence would have weighed on a religious 16th century crew in ways that are easy for a modern reader to underestimate. Not just the practical loss of leadership, but a spiritual wound with no ritual available to close it. This is the story of the moment everything about this voyage changed hands. From a single driven Captain General's vision to a fractured, frightened, increasingly leaderless crew of survivors, who now had to figure out, with no real consensus about who was even in charge, how to get themselves and their remaining 3 ships back to a home most of them hadn't seen in over a year and a half. Whatever happens for the rest of this story, the betrayal waiting at Cebu within days, the desperate scramble to find the Spice Islands they'd crossed an ocean for, the agonizing split decision between 2 ships trying 2 different routes home, none of it is a story Ferdinand Magellan lived to see. And that's exactly the story this next stretch is going to tell. Grief on a ship doesn't get the luxury of time. Within hours of Magellan's death, the surviving officers were already negotiating command of a fleet that suddenly had none. And within days, that vacuum would cost them nearly as many lives as the battle itself had. After the Captain General, the 4 days between Magellan's death and the Cebu banquet weren't calm ones aboard the ships. Whatever the surviving accounts relatively clipped, business-like tone might suggest. With no clear successor named before the battle, Magellan, characteristically, hadn't planned for his own death any more than he'd planned for turning back. The surviving officers had to work out a chain of command essentially from scratch, in the middle of hostile waters, with morale in genuine crisis. Barbosa and Cerro's joint appointment as co-commanders was as much a compromise as a plan, an attempt to balance competing claims to authority at the worst possible moment to be sorting out office politics. Ordinary sailors, watching this unfold from below decks, had every reason to wonder whether the fleet's fragile chain of command would hold together at all, or whether San Julian's mutiny was about to repeat itself in an even more desperate form, this time with no Captain General left alive to suppress it. You wake before dawn on the 1st of May 1521, 4 days after watching your Captain General go down in the surf at Mactan, and the mood aboard is a strange, brittle mixture of grief and forced optimism nobody quite believes. Command has fallen jointly to Duarte Barbosa, Magellan's own brother-in-law, and Ju Cerro, not to be confused with Francisco Cerro, Magellan's old friend already settled out among the Spice Islands. Though the 2 men may well have been relatives, a coincidence that's confused more than one reader of this story over the centuries. This Ju Cerro was a long-time companion of the dead Captain General, and together with Barbosa he's now trying to hold together a crew that's just lost the one figure who'd bullied, threatened, and occasionally inspired them across an entire ocean. Raja Humabon, your supposed ally, has sent word inviting the surviving officers ashore for a formal banquet, a gesture of continued friendship and mutual respect between the 2 allied peoples. It sounds, on paper, like exactly the kind of diplomatic gesture that's carried this voyage through worse moments than this one. Here's what nobody aboard fully understood at the time, and what historians still debate the precise mechanics of today. Something had shifted in Cebu's political calculations after Mactan. A defeat like that, a supposedly invincible foreign fleet, humiliated by a local rival Humabon himself, had pointed them toward, didn't read as reassuring to a ruler whose own alliance now looked considerably more fragile than it had 2 weeks earlier. Enrique is at the center of what several accounts suggest happened next, though the record here is genuinely contested. According to Pigafetta, Enrique had been told by Magellan, before his death, that he would be freed upon his master's death, a promise the surviving officers apparently declined to honor, intending to keep him in service as a translator regardless, and reportedly threatening him with continued servitude in language that left little room for argument. Whether wounded pride, a broken promise, or something else entirely drove what came next, Enrique is widely believed to have relayed word to Humabon's court, suggesting the remaining Spanish officers could be dealt with, disposed of, and their weapons and cargo claimed outright. There were, according to at least one surviving account, warning signs that morning that a more cautious crew might have taken more seriously. A member of the fleet who had converted and taken up residence briefly on shore reportedly slipped word back to the ships that something felt wrong about the invitation. A change in tone among Humabon's household, a nervousness among servants who'd been friendly and open just days earlier. Whether that warning actually reached Barbosa and Cerro before they climbed into the boats, or reached them too late, or reached them at all, isn't something the surviving record settles cleanly. What's clear is that grief, exhaustion, and a genuine, understandable desire to believe their hard-won alliance was still intact, combined to override whatever caution should have applied. After Mactan, after everything already lost, the surviving officers may simply have needed the alliance to still be real more than they needed to interrogate whether it actually was. 27 officers and men went ashore for that banquet. 24 of them, by most accounts, never came back. Barbosa was among the dead. So was the fleet's own astronomer and several other senior officers, killed in what appears to have been a coordinated ambush partway through the meal, cut down inside a feast they'd walked into, believing they were among friends. And here is the detail from that afternoon that Pigafetta himself could barely finish writing down. And that still lands as one of the genuinely hardest moments in this entire voyage. Cerro, Magellan's old friend, wasn't killed in the initial ambush. He was dragged, wounded and bound, down to the shoreline in full view of the ships anchored offshore, and held there as a hostage, while his own remaining crewmates, watching from the decks, weighed whether to risk everything trying to save him. They didn't. Cerro, according to Pigafetta's account, called out from the beach, begging his shipmates by name to ransom him, to send a boat, to do anything other than what they were visibly preparing to do. What they were preparing to do was sail away and leave him there. The surviving officers, reasonably enough from a cold tactical standpoint, and unforgivably enough from any human one, judged that a rescue attempt would likely cost more lives than it saved, against a shore now openly hostile, and a crew already reduced to barely 115 men across 3 ships that needed at least that many hands just to sail home. The ships weighed anchor. Cerro's voice, calling after them, is the last anyone aboard those departing ships ever reported hearing of him. What became of him afterward was never confirmed. Enrique himself vanishes from the written record at almost exactly this same point. No further mention in Pigafetta's journal, no note of his fate in any surviving muster roll. A man who may have closed the first human circumnavigation of the entire planet on foot, and whose ending nobody alive today actually knows. That's not a detail included for shock value. It's included because it's the exact kind of unbearable calculation this entire voyage kept forcing on its crew, over and over, trading one life, one named and known and pleading man, against the survival odds of everyone else still breathing. It happened at San Julian, when a servant was handed a sword. It happened crossing the Pacific, when a young boy shared his own meager ration with a dying officer instead. And it happened here, on a beach at Cebu, in the ugliest possible direction, the crew choosing themselves over a friend, and having to live with that choice for the rest of whatever life they had left. The decision to burn the Concepcion wasn't made lightly, and it wasn't made quickly either. Surviving accounts describe several days of debate among the remaining officers before the ship was finally stripped and set alight off Bohol. Every option on the table was bad. Sailing all three remaining ships short-handed risked losing one or more to poor seamanship in unfamiliar waters. Exactly the kind of accident that had already claimed the Santiago back at San Julian. Abandoning cargo or equipment to lighten the load meant sacrificing supplies the crew might desperately need later. In the end, the Concepcion herself was the sacrifice, and the process of stripping her, removing every usable plank, every coil of rope, every scrap of canvas, every cannon that could be transferred to her sister ships before the torch went in, took the better part of 2 full days, performed by men who understood exactly what they were doing, dismantling, piece by piece, 1/3 of the fleet that had carried them across an entire ocean, in order to give the remaining 2/3 a better chance of finishing the job. In the immediate hours after the ships pulled away from Cebu, with Cero's voice still fading behind them, the fear aboard both remaining vessels wasn't only grief. It was the very practical, very reasonable worry that Humabon's forces, having just successfully ambushed nearly 24 officers, might follow up with an attack on the ships themselves, while the crew was still reeling. Cannons were readied. Extra watches were posted through the night. Nobody aboard slept easily, and for good reason. A fleet this reduced, this leaderless, this far from anything resembling reinforcement, would have had very little left to defend itself with had Cebu's warriors pressed the advantage further. They didn't. Whether out of satisfaction with what they'd already achieved, uncertainty about provoking further Spanish retaliation, or reasons the surviving record simply doesn't preserve, the attack the crew feared that night never came. And by morning the ships were already working their way clear of Cebu's waters entirely, putting as much distance as the wind allowed between themselves and a shoreline that had cost them so much in so little time. With barely enough men remaining to crew even 2 ships properly, let alone 3, the survivors made the practical, heartbreaking call to burn the Concepcion rather than try to sail her short-handed, stripping her of anything useful first, then setting her alight off the coast of Bohol and watching 1/3 of the original fleet go up in smoke, rather than face a 4th loss to shipwreck or mutiny. Command of the 2 remaining ships, the Trinidad and the Victoria, eventually settled on Gonzalo Gmez de Espinosa for the former, and, over the following weeks, Juan Sebastian Elcano, the pardoned San Julian mutineer, working his way steadily back up the chain of command he'd once tried to overthrow, taking an increasingly central role aboard the latter. What followed was months of uncertain wandering through unfamiliar waters, searching for the Spice Islands that had been the entire point of this voyage in the first place, and that Magellan himself had died without ever laying eyes on. Time marker. By early July, roughly 10 weeks after the Cebu massacre, the 2 ships made their way to the Sultanate of Brunei, on the island of Borneo, where the crew was received with a formality and opulence that stunned even men who'd survived a genuine ocean crossing. Sultan Bolkiah's court operated from an enormous settlement built almost entirely on stilts over the water. The crew called it a floating city, and their descriptions of a palace decorated with silk hangings and brass fittings, of ceremonial elephants used for royal transport, quietly demolished whatever assumptions the Spanish crew had carried about which parts of the world counted as civilized. Pigafetta's account of the reception itself reads almost like a fable next to everything else in his journal. The Spanish delegation led through courtyards on the backs of elephants draped in cloth. Received in a hall where the Sultan sat behind a screen of woven silk, visible only in silhouette, attended by pages who carried betel nut boxes of solid gold. Whatever the crew had imagined the Spice Islands region might look like from half a world away, it wasn't this. A court running on a scale of organized, established wealth and ceremony that outstripped, in several visible respects, most of what these particular sailors had ever seen back home. It nearly ended badly regardless. A misunderstanding, possibly deliberate provocation on one side or the other, led to a tense standoff. Several Spanish sailors briefly held as apparent hostages, and a hurried departure under something close to hostile conditions. The crew fleeing Brunei's harbour faster than they'd arrived. By the 8th of November, 1521, very nearly 2 full years after leaving Spain, the Trinidad and Victoria finally reached Tidore, one of the small volcanic islands in the Moluccas that produced, at the time, nearly the entire world's supply of cloves. There was one bitter irony waiting for the crew on arrival that nobody could have planned for. Francisco Cerro, Magellan's old friend whose letters describing this exact archipelago had helped inspire the entire voyage in the first place, had died in local political violence in the Moluccas just months earlier. The two friends missing each other by a matter of weeks after 20 years apart, and one impossible ocean crossing between them. Getting from Brunei to Tidore wasn't a straight line. Either, the two remaining ships spent nearly 4 months threading their way through the islands of what's now the southern Philippines and eastern Indonesia, stops at Palawan for fresh water, at Mindanao for provisions, brief and wary encounters with local traders who'd sometimes never seen a European face before, and sometimes, further south, had already been dealing with Portuguese merchants for years and knew exactly what a foreign ship's arrival tended to mean for local politics. Every stop was its own small negotiation, run now not by a confident captain general with a proven track record of successful alliances, but by 2 exhausted officers commanding a skeleton crew who understood, better than anyone, how quickly a friendly welcome could turn into another Cebu. Sultan al-Mansur of Tidore received the survivors warmly regardless, genuinely pleased at the prospect of a new European trading partner to balance against Portuguese influence already established at nearby Ternate. Over the following weeks, both ships were loaded to their limits with cloves, dried, fragrant, and worth, pound for pound back in Europe, something close to their weight in silver. Loading them was its own considerable labor. Cloves had to be packed carefully into every available space in the hold, wrapped and layered to prevent moisture damage on a voyage that everyone aboard now understood, from bitter experience, could stretch on for months longer than anyone hoped. Sailors who'd spent the better part of 2 years hauling rope and pumping bilge water spent these particular weeks instead handling a cargo worth more, pound for pound, than almost anything else they could have carried. A strange, almost surreal shift in the texture of the work, going from starvation rations to packing away a fortune in dried flower buds, one crate at a time. Here's the thing about arriving, finally, at the exact destination this entire disastrous voyage had been aimed at from the very start. It should have felt like triumph. Mostly, by every surviving account, it felt like exhaustion with cargo attached. And it was here, loading cloves onto 2 increasingly worn-out ships, that the survivors discovered a problem that would force the hardest decision of the entire voyage. A decision about how, or even whether, both remaining ships could make it home at all. There's a version of this closing stretch that tempts a storyteller toward pure triumph. Cloves in the hold, the worst of the voyage supposedly behind them. Home finally within theoretical reach. The real ending is more complicated than that, and considerably more interesting for it. It splits, in fact, into two entirely separate stories, because the two remaining ships never made it home together. The long way home, the Trinidad had a problem the crew discovered only after she'd already been fully loaded with cloves at Tidore. Her hull was taking on water badly, likely from timbers strained during the Strait crossing or the long Pacific voyage, and no amount of pumping seemed to keep pace with the leak. Repairs would take weeks. The fleet didn't have time to spare. Given that the annual trade winds needed to carry a ship safely across either the Pacific or the Indian Ocean operated on a calendar, not a convenience. The decision made under Gonzalo Gómez de Espinosa's command, and with roughly 50 men aboard, was to repair the Trinidad as best they could where she sat, wait out the wrong season, and then attempt something no one had done before in this direction: sail east, back across the vast Pacific, towards Spanish territory in Panama, rather than risk the Portuguese-controlled Indian Ocean route home. The attempt itself began in April of 1522, once repairs to the leaking hull seemed sound enough to trust, and for the first several weeks it looked almost promising. Favorable winds pushing the Trinidad steadily northeast, back up toward latitudes where Espinosa hoped to catch a current that would carry the ship across to the American coast the same way outbound Spanish galleons would, decades later, learn to ride reliably in the opposite direction. That current never came. Not from the direction or in the season Espinosa needed it. Instead, the ship spent months fighting contrary winds that pushed her steadily backward, burning through provisions that had been calculated for a much shorter crossing, while scurvy, the same disease that had already claimed 19 lives on the outbound leg, began working through a crew that had no fresh food left to slow it down. It went about as badly as the Pacific crossing had gone the first time, except worse, because this time there was no strait waiting on the far side to prove the gamble had paid off. Adverse winds and currents that modern oceanographers understand, and 1521's navigators, simply didn't drove the Trinidad back after months of brutal effort, forcing Espinosa to turn around and limp back toward the Moluccas with a crew decimated by scurvy and exhaustion. Portuguese forces, who had been tracking the Spanish incursion into what they considered their exclusive trading territory for the entire voyage, captured the battered ship shortly after her return. Most of her surviving crew spent years in Portuguese captivity across various outposts in Asia, and only a small handful, 4 or 5 men depending on the account, eventually made it back to Spain at all, arriving years later, in 1525 or even later still, as a kind of delayed, almost forgotten postscript to a voyage most of Europe had already assumed was fully finished. Life for the Trinidad's captured crew over those following years was its own grim, largely undocumented postscript to the voyage. Scattered across various Portuguese outposts in Asia, some put to forced labor, others held in conditions closer to genuine imprisonment, with little reliable communication back to Spain, and even less hope, for most of them, of ever seeing it again. Gonzalo Gómez de Espinosa himself was eventually released and made it home, arriving so long after the Victoria's celebrated return that his own survival read, to a Spain that had already finished mourning and moving on, almost like a ghost turning up at his own funeral. Most of his men were never so fortunate. Whatever fraction of the original Trinidad crew didn't survive Portuguese captivity simply disappears from the record at some point in the mid-1520s. Their individual fates as unrecoverable now as Juiceros had been on that beach at Cebu 3 years earlier. The Victoria took the other route, and the other gamble. Under Juan Sebastián Elcano, the once pardoned mutineer, now the last man standing in a chain of command that had started with Magellan, passed through Barbosa and Cerro, and landed improbably on him, the ship set out to sail west, all the way around the southern tip of Africa, and back up into the Atlantic, the long way home. roughly 60 men aboard for a leg of the journey that would prove nearly as deadly as anything that had come before it. She made one last documented provisioning stop at the island of Timor in early February 1522, trading what little the crew had left for sandalwood, rice and fresh water, the final port of any kind the ship would touch, until she reached waters controlled by her own crown. The stretch of the Indian Ocean between Timor and the Cape was its own long, quiet ordeal, largely undocumented compared to the drama of Mactan or the massacre at Cebu, simply because there was less event to it. Just weeks upon weeks of open water, a shrinking crew, and the same grim rationing math that had already nearly killed everyone once crossing the Pacific. Elcano, unlike Magellan, had the bitter advantage of already knowing exactly what a long ocean crossing on short rations did to a crew, and he pushed the Victoria's remaining men to conserve everything they possibly could from the moment Timor slipped below the horizon behind them, aware that whatever waited around the southern tip of Africa would demand every remaining ounce of food and water they had left. There's something worth dwelling on in the simple fact that command of this final, hardest leg fell to Elcano specifically. A Basque ship's master from the small coastal town of Getaria, he'd sailed as an experienced mariner even before this voyage, competent enough that his role in the San Julian mutiny had been more a matter of practical loyalty to fellow officers than personal ambition to unseat Magellan. He'd spent the better part of 2 years since then quietly rebuilding whatever trust that mutiny had cost him, taking on more responsibility as the fleet's officer corps kept shrinking around him, first at Cebu, then aboard the Victoria specifically once Barbosa and Cerro were gone. By the time the ship reached Tidore, he wasn't chosen for this command so much as he was simply the man left standing with the seniority and the skill to take it. History rarely hands its consequential roles to people who spent years angling for them. More often, as here, it hands them to whoever's still on their feet when everyone more senior has already been lost. Rounding the Cape of Good Hope in May of 1522 meant sailing without stopping for repairs or resupply anywhere along the way, since every port along that route belonged to Portugal. And a Spanish ship caught this far outside its treaty-sanctioned waters risked seizure, imprisonment, or worse. Elcano kept the Victoria running for roughly 5 to 6 weeks around the Cape, on rations that had already been thin before they'd even started, through weather that battered the hull, and a crew whose scurvy symptoms had begun returning with a vengeance the moment fresh food ran out again. By the time the ship limped up the west coast of Africa toward the Cape Verde Islands in early July, desperation had won out over caution, and Elcano made port there anyway, sending a shore party ashore under a deliberate lie, claiming the Victoria was returning from the Americas' Spanish territory, rather than admit she'd just crossed the Portuguese-controlled Indian Ocean and rounded Africa entirely, which would have been treated as a direct violation of the treaty splitting the world between the two crowns. Elcano had drilled the cover story into the shore party before they ever lowered the boat, say nothing of the Moluccas, nothing of the Indian Ocean, nothing of the Strait or the Pacific or any of it. Just a simple, unremarkable trading voyage returning from the Spanish Americas, in need of rice and nothing more. It might even have worked, had the shore party consisted of men with any energy left for careful lying. But desperation makes for sloppy diplomacy, and somewhere in the course of bartering for provisions, exhausted and half out of his mind with relief at solid ground and the prospect of real food, one of the sailors let slip a mention of cloves, the one word guaranteed to tell any Portuguese official exactly where this ship had actually been, and exactly which treaty it had just violated. The lie held for exactly as long as it took a loose-tongued sailor in the shore party to mention cloves. Portuguese authorities in the Cape Verdes arrested the entire shore party, 13 men, on the spot. Elcano, watching from the ship, and correctly judging that any rescue attempt would end with the Victoria seized too and the entire voyage's cargo and evidence lost along with it, made the same brutal calculation Barboza and Cerro's crew had made at Cebu over a year earlier. He weighed anchor and sailed without them. Those 13 men, it's worth noting, before this story moves past them, were eventually released by Portuguese authorities and made their own separate way home over the following months. A smaller, quieter footnote of survival, tucked inside a story that mostly runs the other direction. What followed was the final, cruelest leg of a voyage that had already claimed close to 200 lives. 21 more men died on the stretch between the Cape Verdes and Spain, mostly from scurvy and outright starvation, the ship arriving at its final destination with a crew so reduced and so weakened that some of the last survivors reportedly could barely stand upright to work the sails. Among the 18 men still standing on that final approach was a ship's page named Juan de Zubileta, who had signed on as a boy of barely 13 back in 1519, and was now at 16 one of the most senior surviving members of the entire expedition, simply by virtue of having lived through everything that killed everyone else around him. The mutiny, the strait, the 98 days of leather and sawdust, Macton, the massacre at Cebu, the long crawl around Africa. It's a strange kind of survival to try to picture. Not heroism in any single dramatic moment, just 3 straight years of being young, low-ranked, easy to overlook, and somehow still standing at the end of it, having grown from a child into very nearly a man entirely at sea, on ships that kept losing the people around him one by one. On the 6th of September 1522, the Victoria dropped anchor at Sanlúcar de Barrameda, the exact port the fleet had departed from almost exactly 3 years earlier, with just 18 men aboard out of an expedition that had originally numbered roughly 270 across 5 ships. 18. Add in the handful who'd eventually straggle home from Portuguese captivity aboard the Trinidad, plus the Cape Verde prisoners who were later released and made their own way back, and the total number of men who survived the entire voyage in some form lands somewhere around 35. Barely 1 in 8 of everyone who'd sailed out of this same harbour in September of 1519. There's one more small, strange detail worth including here, because it's true, and because it's the kind of thing that only becomes visible once you've circled an entire planet. When the surviving crew went ashore in Sanlúcar and asked what the date was, they were told it was Wednesday, the 7th of September. Their own ship's log, kept scrupulously the entire voyage, insisted it was Tuesday, the 6th. Nobody aboard had made an error. What the crew had actually discovered, without anyone yet having a name or explanation for it, was the simple mathematical consequence of having sailed continuously westward, all the way around a rotating planet, gaining a day's worth of longitude on the sun with every leg of the journey, until an entire 24 hours had quietly vanished from their own private calendar without a single man aboard noticing it happen. It's a small footnote against everything else in this story. It's also, in its own understated way, one of the purest pieces of physical proof the 16th century ever produced that the Earth really is round, and really can be circled, delivered by accident, by 18 exhausted men who mostly just wanted solid ground and a decent meal. The cargo Elcano brought home told its own story in numbers that mattered enormously to the crown that had funded this whole disaster. Roughly 26 tons of cloves, sold in Spain, brought in enough silver to cover the entire cost of outfitting all 5 original ships, mutiny, shipwrecks, deaths, and all, with a genuine profit left over. Elcano himself was granted a personal coat of arms by Charles V, a globe, circled by the Latin motto Primus circumdedisci me, you were the first to circle me, a title that, by any strict accounting, belonged at least as much to the man who'd planned the entire voyage and never lived to complete it, as it did to the man standing in Spain to physically receive it. The 18 survivors themselves, before any of the pageantry of royal recognition, reportedly insisted on walking barefoot in simple shirts to a nearby church the moment they came ashore at Sanalkar, candles in hand, to give thanks for having lived through what they'd lived through. A small, quiet, deeply human gesture from men who'd spent 3 years watching shipmates die of starvation, execution, and violence, and who apparently felt considerably less need to celebrate than to simply, finally, be still somewhere safe. Word of their return spread through Spain and then through the rest of Europe within weeks, transforming a voyage most educated people had privately written off as lost into the single most talked about maritime achievement of the century. Charles V received Elcano formally at court not long after, granted him a substantial pension alongside the coat of arms, and effectively closed the book on a voyage that had cost the crown roughly 4 out of every 5 men who'd sailed on it, and had returned in the end a genuine, if brutally expensive, profit. And that's really the shape of the whole story, isn't it? Magellan gave this voyage its vision, its stubbornness, its willingness to gamble everything on a strait he'd never actually seen. But the voyage that actually made it all the way around the world, through a massacre he didn't live to grieve, a captivity he never had to endure, a starving crawl around the bottom of Africa he never had to survive, belonged to the 18 men still standing when the Victoria finally dropped her anchor. Antonio Pigafetta was one of them. His notebook, filled across 3 years with cramped, careful ink through mutiny, starvation, wonder, and grief, survived every single thing that killed the men around him. And it's the reason any of us, 5 centuries later, can still picture the weevils in the biscuit, the boy sharing his ration, or a friend's voice calling from a beach that no one turned back for. He would go on to present his account personally to Charles V, and versions of his journal have circulated in one form or another ever since. The single most complete surviving record of a voyage that, without his stubborn insistence on writing things down through the very worst of it, might otherwise have come home as little more than a cargo manifest and a body count. There's one more thing worth remembering before we let this story go for the night. Almost nobody involved in it got the ending they expected. Magellan expected to lead his fleet home in triumph and never saw the Spice Islands at all. Cartagena expected to seize command and died alone on an empty shore no one ever searched. Enrique may have expected freedom and instead simply vanishes from the page. Even Elcano, who received the coat of arms and the pension and the king's personal gratitude, spent the rest of his life defending his own conduct against critics who never fully forgave him for sailing away from Cebu, from the Cape Verdes, from men left behind in the name of everyone else's survival. Almost every triumph inside this story sits directly on top of a grief nobody had time to properly finish grieving. That's not a flaw in how the story gets told. That's just what it actually was. So here we are, all the way back around the world from where we started. A fireside in your own home. A fleet that left Sanlúcar de Barrameda in September of 1519 with 270 men and 5 ships, and arrived back at that same dock 3 years later with 18 men and 1. Somewhere in between, a Venetian nobleman who wasn't even supposed to be a sailor kept scribbling in a small notebook through a mutiny. 100 days of leather and sawdust, a captain's death in the surf at Magellan, and a friend's voice on a beach that nobody turned the ships around for. Magellan never got to read a word of it. He never learned his name would end up on the strait, the ocean, and eventually a spacecraft launched toward Venus more than 400 years after his death. He never found out that a pardoned mutineer named Elcano would be the one to finish what he started, or that his own interpreter, Enrique, may have quietly closed the circle around the globe on foot before any ship ever did. What he'd probably have wanted to know, if you could somehow tell him now, is simpler than any of that it worked, that the strait was real, that the ocean on the other side, whatever it cost to cross, really did lead somewhere. 18 exhausted men proved that for him, 3 years and one lost calendar day later, arriving home with a hold full of cloves and a silence where 252 of their shipmates used to be. You're warm right now, the way you were at the start of tonight's story. You're not choking down leather off a yardarm or watching a friend's voice fade from a beach you're sailing away from. You're just here, wrapped in something soft, listening to a story about people who crossed the entire width of the world so that 500 years later, you'd have the simple, uncomplicated comfort of knowing exactly how big it is. You're warm. You're safe. And somewhere out past the edge of everything, 18 men finally made it home. Sleep well.